February 24, 1945, Berlin, the once proud capital of the Third Reich, had become a wounded beast, its streets broken open by shell fire, its buildings leaning like exhausted soldiers after years of bombardment. Smoke rose from the ruins in slow grey spirals, drifting into a sky that rarely saw sunlight. But far beneath the destruction, insulated under layers of concrete and steel, another world remained. A dimly lit labyrinth where denial was stronger than truth. The Führerbunker sat more than 40 feet underground, an airtight capsule filled with recycled air and a growing sense of doom. Its narrow corridors were lined with pipes that clanked whenever the heating system groaned awake. Water seeped from the ceiling in thin trickles that staff hurriedly wiped away. The floors always felt damp, and when doors opened, the stale smell of sweat and disinfectant drifted outward like a sigh from a dying machine. Into this damp, suffocating world walked Adolf Hitler. He entered the map room with a stiffness that betrayed the battle occurring inside his own body. His left arm hung rigid, occasionally twitching in a tremor he could not suppress. His right foot dragged slightly before setting down, and his hands moved in small, stuttering arcs rather than the commanding gestures that had once captivated masses. Parkinson's disease, though unnamed in official documents, had progressed far enough that those close to him realized it was no longer possible to hide. His face, pale and slack, carried the expression of a man aging in fast motion. The lines around his mouth had deepened, and his eyes, once sharp and animated, looked almost watery, as if the effort to focus drained him. Dr. Theodor Morell hovered nearby, a shadow made of syringes and medicine vials. Morell had administered his usual cocktail that morning, methamphetamine to jolt Hitler's mind awake, opiates to soothe the persistent stomach pain, and cocaine drops to sharpen his vision. These drugs created a brittle sense of alertness, a thin layer of energy stretched over a collapsing system. Hitler believed they gave him strength. In reality, they offered only temporary clarity, followed by deeper crashes. The bunker staff watched him pace. They noticed the tremors, the laboured breathing, the way he clutched the edge of the table when he leaned over the maps. But no one spoke of it. To comment on the Führer's frailty would be to acknowledge the inevitable, and in the bunker, the inevitable was never allowed to exist. Hitler approached the large operational map pinned against the wall. Red and black arrows represented forces that were either shattered, retreating, or swallowed by encirclement. The pins marking German units had been moved back so often that the map was full of tiny holes. Every day the Reich shrank in ink and paper before it shrank on the battlefield. Yet Hitler still behaved as though he could shape events through sheer will. He studied the map silently for a long moment, his head tilted forward, his breathing uneven. The overhead light flickered. Someone in the corner coughed. Then Hitler spoke, his voice hoarse but carrying the same certainty he had used in public speeches years earlier. "The Ardennes was a success," he murmured. "We proved our resolve. We showed the Americans what Germany is capable of. They are shaken, demoralized. If we strike once more, with the right force, they will collapse." The officers in the room exchanged glances. None believed this. None dared to challenge it. In the bunker, silence had become an essential survival skill. The world outside was collapsing, but Hitler's mind lived elsewhere, clinging to the last illusion. 1 month earlier, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final major offensive in the West, had ended in unmitigated disaster. He had envisioned a dramatic echo of 1940, a sudden thrust through the Ardennes forest that would cleave the Allied lines, isolate British forces, and force Washington and London to negotiate. But winter 1944 was not spring 1940. The offensive tore a dangerous gap in the Allied front, but at a price Germany could not endure. Entire panzer divisions were chewed apart in the frozen forests. Tank crews abandoned vehicles along icy roads when fuel ran out. Battalions disappeared into snow-covered fields without a trace. Units stripped from the Eastern Front to reinforce the offensive left that front dangerously exposed, and their absence was felt immediately as the Soviets surged forward. Many commanders had warned Hitler that the plan was reckless. They lacked the tanks, the trucks, the ammunition, and especially the fuel to sustain a major breakthrough. But Hitler wanted another miracle, a strike that would change the course of the war as dramatically as past gambles had done. He believed his generals were too cautious. He believed the Americans lacked the will to endure heavy losses. He believed destiny would side with boldness. Historian Antony Beevor writes that the Ardennes Offensive was not strategy but delusion made operational. Even as reports of disaster poured in, stalled columns, fuel starvation, units trapped in Allied counterattacks, Hitler dismissed them. When commanders pleaded for withdrawal to avoid annihilation, he labelled them defeatists. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were staggering. More than 100,000 German troops had been killed, wounded, or captured. The Wehrmacht's last operational armoured reserve had been shattered. Vital aircraft had been lost. Fuel depots were emptied. Ammunition stocks were drained. And the Eastern Front, robbed of divisions, buckled further under Soviet attacks. The Bulge did not simply fail. It devoured the last strength the German army possessed. Yet in the bunker, Hitler refused even to consider the possibility that the offensive had been a mistake. He clung to the idea that the Americans had suffered worse, and that Germany could still achieve a decisive victory if only the generals executed his orders with enough fanatic resolve. The truth was that the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the means to conduct major operations. The Bulge had consumed what remained of Germany's ability to wage offensive war, and it had left the defensive front so thin that the Allies could now see the Rhine, the last major barrier to Germany's heartland, looming before them. Still, the bunker denied the truth. The collapse of the Ardennes was mirrored by the collapse of Hitler's health. He had always been an insomniac, but now sleep eluded him entirely. He ate little. He complained constantly of stomach pain, headaches, dizziness, and trembling. Even the simplest movements required effort. His left hand shook so visibly that he often held it behind his back, pretending to be deep in thought when he was simply trying to hide the tremor. Colonel Nicholas von Below later recalled that Hitler sometimes froze in place, staring intently at the map table as if waiting for it to speak. His mind drifted unpredictably between past victories and imagined future triumphs. The bunker staff often heard him walking in circles late at night, muttering to himself. At times, he ranted about betrayal. At other times, he spoke softly, making pronouncements that sounded like private prophecies. Historian Ian Kershaw describes these weeks as the moment when Hitler's delusions became constant. He no longer had moments of clarity, only waves of intensity that alternated between feverish confidence and brooding silence. He clung to the belief that willpower alone could determine the fate of nations. He rejected intelligence reports claiming they were manipulated by defeatists, and he insisted that spirit, not material resources, determined victory. Norman Ohler explains why. Morell's escalating injections had turned Hitler into a prisoner of chemical cycles. Periods of euphoria were followed by sharp crashes that deepened paranoia. The drugs offered temporary mental clarity but destroyed the ability to perceive reality. By early 1945, Hitler's decisions were shaped as much by chemistry as by ideology. In this state, isolated, sick, drug-dependent, he planned operations using divisions that existed only on paper. He believed the Volkssturm, composed of elderly men and teenage boys, could hold the line against Allied armour. He imagined counterattacks that required fuel Germany no longer had. He invoked past German heroes, believing Providence would intervene as it had for Frederick the Great. But Providence had long since abandoned the bunker. February 24th held symbolic weight for Hitler. It was the anniversary of the Nazi Party program announced in Munich 25 years earlier. the manifesto that had transformed him from a fringe agitator into a political force. He wanted to commemorate the date. But he could not appear in public. His trembling hands, hunched posture, and laboured movement would shatter the myth of the unbreakable Führer. Instead, he dictated a proclamation in the bunker, pacing slowly as secretaries typed. Traudl-Junge remembered how his voice alternated between whispers and sudden bursts of intensity. She saw his left leg shake violently as he leaned over the table, hands clasped behind his back. He seemed almost feverish, as though driven by some internal urgency. The speech he dictated bore little connection to the reality of Germany's situation. He spoke of renewed strength, unshakable unity, and the certainty of final victory. He invoked providence repeatedly, claiming Germany's struggle was part of a divine plan. He described the Allies as weak, divided, and spiritually corrupt. He spoke as though 1945 were simply another chapter in a long saga of heroic resistance. Goebbels read the speech over the radio. His voice, sharp and theatrical, attempted to mask the desperation behind the words, but many Germans who heard it recognized the disconnect. The bombs outside contradicted every promise. The men freezing on the Eastern Front knew the Soviet advance was unstoppable. Families sheltering in basements had long stopped believing in miracles. Kershaw identifies this proclamation as a symbolic moment, the point where Hitler's rhetoric no longer served political strategy but functioned instead as a shield against psychological collapse. It was less a speech than a final attempt to conjure a world in which defeat was impossible. The true consequences of the Ardennes disaster became clear in February and March 1945. Before the offensive, Germany's Western Front held more than 70 divisions. Afterward, barely 60 remained, many reduced to half strength or less. Armoured formations were so depleted that some could field only a handful of operational tanks. The Luftwaffe, battered by losses during the Bulge, could no longer challenge Allied air superiority. And fuel, the lifeblood of mechanized war, had been consumed to near exhaustion. As a result, the Rhine, which had historically served as one of Europe's most formidable natural barriers, was now defended by forces that existed more in name than in reality. American forces reached the river with astonishing speed. Commanders expected the Germans to demolish the bridges well in advance, but Hitler's obsession with symbolism interfered. He believed blowing a bridge too early signaled weakness. Thus orders were delayed. On March 7th, American troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, a moment of surreal fortune. German engineers had attempted to rig it with explosives, but the charges were insufficient, and the detonation order had come far too late. US forces surged across, establishing the first major bridgehead on the eastern shore. This breakthrough stunned the German high command. Hitler erupted in fury, ordering executions for those he deemed responsible. But rage could not reverse the situation. Patton crossed days later near Oppenheim with such ease that he boasted the crossing was as simple as a Sunday stroll. Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder, involving thousands of artillery pieces and an airborne assault, encountered such feeble resistance that Allied commanders were shocked at how quickly the eastern bank fell. Beevor argues that the Bulge had hollowed out the Rhine defences before the Allies even reached them. The divisions that should have defended the river had been bled dry in the Ardennes. Many units stationed along the Rhine were Volkssturm contingents armed with old rifles, Panzerfausts, and desperation. They could not hope to delay the Allied advance, let alone stop it. By late March, the Rhine was no longer a barrier. It was a doorway. Inside the bunker, the fall of the Rhine should have shattered Hitler's illusions. Instead, it deepened them. His health deteriorated further. Witnesses described his complexion as sallow and almost translucent under the bunker lights. He struggled to walk long distances in the bunker passageways and often leaned heavily on furniture. His meals grew smaller, his sleep shorter, his rants more intense. Speer visited and found him trembling violently, yet radiating an eerie confidence. Hitler insisted that Germany would somehow pull off a miraculous reversal. He cited ancient examples, Rome after Cannae, Prussia during the 7 Years' War, as evidence that history rewarded resilience. But these analogies had long ceased to apply. Germany had no reserves left, no resources, no allies, and no time. When reality could no longer be moulded to fit his worldview, Hitler turned against Germany itself. The Nero Decree, issued in March, ordered the destruction of infrastructure across the Reich. If the Germans had failed him, he reasoned, they no longer deserved the nation he had built. Bridges, factories, transportation networks, all were to be demolished. It was the final proof that Hitler's belief in Germany had always been conditional. He loved the Germany that existed in his imagination, not the people suffering in the real one. The men around him ignored the decree. Speer secretly instructed officials not to carry out the destruction. Many others chose sabotage over obedience, but the order revealed the depth of Hitler's despair and the extent of his disconnection from reality. By April, the Soviets were closing in on Berlin. American and British forces were racing through central Germany. The Rhine crossings had become highways into the heart of the Reich. And in the bunker, Hitler's world had shrunk to a few dim rooms, lit by weak bulbs and sustained by fantasy. The proclamation Hitler dictated on February 24, 1945, remains one of the most revealing documents of the war. It shows a leader whose physical strength had withered, whose armies were collapsing, and whose decisions were shaped by delusion rather than strategy. It also shows how the failure of the Ardennes Offensive had consequences, not just on the battlefield, but in the mind of the man who ordered it. The Battle of the Bulge destroyed Germany militarily. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge its failure destroyed Germany strategically. The Rhine did not fall because the Allies were unstoppable, but because Germany no longer had the means to stop them. The forces that might have resisted were lost in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. The reserves that could have strengthened the line had been consumed by Hitler's last gamble, and the leader who should have adapted instead retreated into fantasies of inevitable victory. When the Allies crossed the Rhine, they crossed not only a river but the boundary between illusion and reality. They marched through the ruins of Hitler's vision, a vision sustained by drugs, denial, and the collapsing fragments of ideology. And in the bunker beneath the shattered city, Hitler clung to his last illusion, until the very end, that destiny still belonged to him.